I figure the best way to do this is to give you a basic story of how I came to Judaism, and then open it up to questions that you might have. My life as an evangelical Christian wasn't by choice. I was born into it. In fact, my mother likes to tell people that I was speaking in tongues before I could walk. She tells people a story about how I would go banging up and down the hallways with my walker, with my eyes closed and my hands in the air, babbling gibberish at the top of my lungs. Of course, I was imitating my father, who at the time was a newly ordained Assembly of God minister. So a little bit about my personality you should know before we get too far is I've been described as zealous at times. I prefer the word passionate. When I put my head to something, I go all in. And even though I say I didn't have a choice in being a Christian, I did go all in. As a preacher's kid, when the doors of the church were open, I was there. Youth programs, missionettes, which is sort of a Christian form of Girl Scouts. I went on mission trips, preachers' kids retreats, etc. Basically, I lived in the church, was fully immersed, and was very dedicated to being a good Christian and living a good, clean Christian lifestyle. As you can imagine, as a teenager, that wasn't so easy. It was a big push by the church to be a missionary to our peers. I was good at it. I invited other students to church programs with the objective of getting them to accept Jesus. Of course, this made me a weirdo at school, but I managed it okay because the church has this psychological mindset that they teach. Probably seems a little awkward to you, but the Christian Bible refers to persecution as a sign of great faith. So the more persecuted you are, the greater your faith must be, and the more pleased God is with you. So when I wore my Jesus shirts and I carried my Bible to school, or I studied during my lunch breaks, I was called Bible Thumper, and that didn't bother me. It just made me more proud. I wore it like a badge of honor, because my faith was everything to me. And it wasn't all for show. I studied my Bible during lunch because I had to. My father was pretty strict. He was a military man. Drill sergeant, in fact. He went into law enforcement, and that was his day job. I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the things I think I'm most grateful for is that my father pushed me to think independently and to learn things for ourselves. I'm the oldest of 5 children. We each, every week, had to come up with what Jews call a Devar Torah. So we weren't allowed to use any ready-made references. Today, I would go to the Torah tidbits and pull some inspiration from there, but that was not acceptable to my father. He would make us, whatever subject we picked, he'd make us research it thoroughly, and we had to be able to quote the sources. Along the way, my parents divorced, and unable to keep his ordination through the Assemblies of God, my father went back to seminary and became ordained as a non-denominational minister, and he started his own church. It was non-denominational, but it was really just as evangelical as everything I've been involved with before. My mother, of course, started going to her own church, and that was my first exposure to Judaism, which wasn't really Jewish at all. My mother had chosen a typical Assemblies of God church that was morphing into Messianic Judaism, which is Christianity that learns about and often observes Jewish holidays. I loved that. It was through that church that I learned a lot of the Jewish traditions, and I really loved discovering the meaning behind all of the Jewish traditions. Of course, once again, there was a strong pull to evangelize. This time it wasn't to everybody, but specifically to Jews. I've been trained as a missionary before, but becoming a missionary to Jewish people was much more intense. Why? Because Jews, even secular ones, know the Bible pretty well. Of course, Jews completely reject the New Testament, so the technique of getting a Jew to accept Jesus was to show them how Jesus was the Messiah through their own Bible, which to me was the Old Testament. This new way of missionizing was challenging. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a fighter, so it was a challenge I was willing to accept. I went all in. So just as I started my training, it took on a whole new meaning for me. It wasn't just a challenge anymore. I fell in love with the Jewish people, and it was a very deep and sincere love. You've probably all met one of these types before. The kind of Christians that are really sweet. They're very sincere, and they mamash would do anything for you just because you're a Jew. And we have so many organizations in Israel today. They're Christian organizations, and they're dedicated to fulfilling every need of every Jew. Believe me, it's not fake. It's very sincere. And that's something everybody should understand. They're not bad people. And the act of converting you isn't from an evil place. They're very sincere, and they have a deep love, and they feel that love is inspired by God himself, and that God put that love in their heart for his people. But it's also that intense love for God's chosen people that brings them to do whatever it takes to get you to accept Jesus. And because, Christianity teaches that a Jew that doesn't accept Jesus is going to suffer eternal damnation. That means hell, a lake of fire, and lots of scary stuff. For somebody who knows to love the Jewish people, that's very concerning. And it becomes a passion and an obsession out of love. So that's where I was at. I committed to learning how to bring Jews to Jesus and saving God's chosen people from this terrible fate. The way to do this was by knowing every Old Testament proof that Jesus was the Messiah. And I did it. I have a knack for memorization, and I memorized every reference. There's a reference chart. It's they map it all out with Old Testament prophecies and New Testament fulfillment. I memorized every reference, and it became more clear than ever that Jesus was absolutely the Messiah, and the only reason a Jew would reject it was because they simply refused to look at it. Unfortunately, it was very good, and I was successful in converting secular Jews. And at the time, I was very proud of that. Now that hurts me very much. My problem wasn't with secular Jews. It came about when I would encounter more religious Jews. Religious Jews would taunt me a little bit, telling me that I didn't know what I was talking about, that the actual Hebrew is different, and your translations are wrong, or that I had something out of context. It was very clear that I was going to have to really know my stuff if I was ever going to reach a religious Jew. So more determined than ever, I went back to studying that fulfillment chart, the prophecy fulfillment chart that I had memorized. I was now going to go back and memorize every chapter in the whole book if I had to. I was very determined. And that is where my life took a very dramatic turn. My mission to understand more only made me more utterly confused. I never felt so stupid. I understood what I was reading, but I couldn't make the connections anymore on how that was a fulfillment of prophecy. I went to my pastor and my teachers and told them I had this problem. Apparently, it was still very clear to them, but I was just not getting it. And the answer I kept getting time after time was, it doesn't have to make sense. You just lack faith. And that was offensive and hurt me because I lived and breathed my faith. I might not understand at the moment, but I didn't lack faith. My faith was unshakable. To make a long story short, I found a website, Judaism's response to Christian missionaries. My original plan was I'll learn to debate, because if the texts don't make sense and I can't explain those, I'm just going to learn to counter their arguments and I'll convert them that way. And that's where it really fell apart. It wasn't my lack of faith that was the problem. It was that I was learning too much. Because when you put the verses in context with the rest of the chapter or the rest of the book, it no longer means what I had been taught that it meant. So after going through each and every one of them, one by one, they all fell apart. Either because they were out of context or mistranslated, or like the religious people said before, it's not right. Some of them were even completely made up. At that point, I think I went through every stage of grief. It was intense sadness because everything that was central in my life and everything I knew to be true was totally wrong. I knew nothing. Everything was a lie. And that brought about intense anger. Anger that these texts were used so deceptively and that it was purposely changed and that it was purposely mistranslated. There was an agenda that was infuriating. Suddenly, there was no God in my life, which led to a very helpless and hopeless state of being. I would cry uncontrollably in intense mental agony. And when there is no God, who do you cry out to in those moments? Psychologists refer to it as a major life change, equivalent to losing a spouse or a significant loved one. And that's what it was. Even though in reality, Jesus was basically an imaginary friend, it was somebody that I had lost that was very close to me, somebody I was having conversations with every day. It was one with me since I was a child. Meant everything to me, and my whole life revolved around it. Suddenly, my life was empty. There was nothing for me to do, nowhere for me to go. There was no significance in my life anymore. There was no purpose. And honestly, that's a very dangerous place for anybody to be. It wasn't until I spoke directly to this rabbi whose lessons I'd been learning that things began to change. My biggest problem was that Jesus and God were always one person. And when, I think most of you probably know, Christianity teaches that there's 3 different personalities, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. One can't exist without the other, which is why they don't understand why that's idolatry. I had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Jesus may or may not have existed at all. And in my mind, if he didn't exist, then there's just no God. So this rabbi gently explained to me that God created me and he loved me dearly. He managed to get through to me that God was still very much there for me, and that I just simply discovered that there was no need for a middleman, that I could go directly to him. From that point on, I decided to learn everything, and I was only going to learn what was true. In many ways, that took a lot of unlearning, realizing that I really knew nothing. When I learned Tanakh now, without the Christian theology built into it, it's so pure and so refreshing. Something about Christianity, when you delve deeper into learning, the more confusing it gets. When you learn Tanakh without the Christian lens, and you probably do this, when you get into deeper levels of learning, things become more clear and it just gets deeper. And that's something I had never experienced before. Another important point I think it is to realize when you hear stories like mine, whether it be a Jew who converted to Christianity or a Christian who found Judaism, there's a pretty big difference. When a Jew converts to Christianity, almost always it's an emotional decision. They follow some sort of crisis or hitting rock bottom. They find Christianity when they reach the absolute lowest point in their life, and somebody somehow reached them at that point. I found that in the opposite, when a Christian finds Judaism, if you listen to the stories, it's almost always an intellectual decision. It comes at a time where they felt that they were extremely learned. It comes at a time where they feel at the top of their game. They're confident in their faith. I'm not a psychologist, but that speaks a lot to me. Today, when I visit families and I share a Shabbat meal, I envy even the youngest children who can give it to Bar Torah at the table. And they know truth, and they know more about the Bible than I knew at 30-something years old when I discovered this. They have the tremendous fortune of a day school education, which I envy very much. I don't think Jews fully comprehend the gift that you're given to be raised in such truth and such purity. There's no theology, there's no agenda, it's just a simple truth that God made us. We're his people. He brought us out of the desert. Despite all our flaws, he continues to keep his promises to Israel. That's, in a nutshell, how I found Judaism. I'll leave it up to Hannah to decide whether we have time for questions or not.
First of all, I would say from the bottom of my
Sure.
Would you say that your experience has been a unique experience, or have you come across other ladies, or men for that matter, who have experienced what you've been through?
There are so many who have come, a lot of them through the exact same path. I had the fortune of meeting many. I still, people reach out to me. I'm very public in social media and online. My story is public. Tonight's the first time I've ever spoken about it in public. But people reach out to me and find me. And there's a lot. There's a tremendous influx of converts from all over with amazing stories. Sure.
Do you still have a relationship with your family?
Oh boy, I didn't address that. Actually, my father, because he was a typical minister, I thought that he would be the most difficult. My mother, who was in this Messianic Judaism and was learning all the Jewish holidays, I thought she'd be more accepting. But it was actually opposite. I'll try to tell a quick story. When I was doing this, I would turn all the books in my house backward when I was learning, because I didn't want my parents to see what I was seeing or see anything Hebrew. My father called one night. I started out in conservative. It was a shul Friday night. My father called and said, "I'm coming to your house. I have to be in the area for tomorrow morning. I'm spending the night." And I panicked because everything I was studying was on the table. I hadn't had a chance to put it away. I was terrified. I felt like a 5-year-old little girl walking into the house. And my father said, "I see what you're looking at. I see what you're doing." Even though I was going to conservative, I was learning Orthodox. You're changing the way you dress. You're changing the way you eat. And I'm a detective with the sheriff's department. I've seen this before. You're getting involved in the cult. And he says, "I see what you're looking at, and we need to learn together, and I'm going to bring you back to where you should be." And I said, "Good, because I don't know what the heck's going on. I've got all this stuff." I showed him what I was looking at, and I gave him the exact material that I was studying, and I figured that would buy me a week or two to come up with some way to explain to him what I was doing. I had officially entered the conversion process already. And he stayed that night. And he stayed up all night. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he knocked on my door. And he sat in this catatonic state on my bed and said, "That rabbi is absolutely right. Everything." I went verse by verse. I tried to dispute it. He's right about everything. And I cried a little bit. He said, "What do we do now?" That's where I'm at. I don't know. So he's left Christianity. He's no longer a minister. My mother, on the other hand, had a harder time with it. She didn't speak to me for a few years. It was very difficult to her. It was if everything I taught you was wrong, that's what you're telling me, and I understand her because she felt I was trying to I was destroying our family, I was destroying our relationship, and in many ways she was right. A lot of people tell me it's not your fault, you're not pushing it on her, you're not making her eat kosher, but it is. It's a big deal because we can no longer have those Christmas gatherings. We can't have Thanksgiving dinner together. We can't do any of those things that we used to do. So it does destroy a family. It's not just my decision. It did affect her. But we didn't speak for a few years. I was going to hell. I was taking her grandchildren with me, which was pretty terrible.
Do you have siblings?
I do have siblings, which some are a little more religious and some are not. They've been a little more accepting, except when your lives drift apart and you're so different, it's hard to keep those connections really close. They have birthday parties on Saturdays, so it doesn't work out so well.
The Noahide movement, that didn't attract you? I mean, to be a Noahide instead of going through the grueling conversion process?
Everybody who comes to me and they just fresh left the church, I recommend the Noahide movement to them first. But it is difficult because you're coming from a place where you have such a strong community and a community of people, much like Jews. It would be very difficult to live without your community. There's something that needs to fill that void, and I encourage them to get involved in some sort of social activity, a bridge club, an art group, a book club. Something has to fill that sense of community. But I definitely recommend that first. I just happened to be somebody who that wasn't enough for, and I was very attracted to the focus on family, and I love Shabbat. Shabbat's something you can't really explain to anybody. Nobody understands it until you keep Shabbat. You just can't explain it to somebody. Like gefilte fish.
I had one other question about the burgeoning relationship between Israel and the evangelical movement. Like how do you see that happening? Are you concerned about that? Do you support that?
It is concerning. That's one of the things I'm involved with leadership in Rabbanim. It's very concerning because although I know that it's out of love and they're not evil people, I also know that that is their goal. It is always their agenda. It's
a conversion.
It is the theology of the church, and even though it comes from a good place, that is the end goal. And with all of them, there is no exceptions really. So,
I think of one more question, and then both your children are Jewish now.
Yes, they are. My daughter, by the time we finished the process, had to meet with her own baby because she was about bat mitzvah. My son was accepted under mine because he was 4.
We wanted to present you something.